Hi, I'm Ronnie from Ronnie's Garage, and we're holding our monthly tech meet at my garage. And today we're going to be bleeding the brakes on a Silver Shadow. Alright, here we go. Now we're going to get into the Silver Shadow. This is probably, especially at its time, the highest maintenance vehicle on the planet. And still is. That's why you didn't see very many for a long time. Because they sat, they weren't worth anything, and nobody fixed them because it cost more to fix them to make them roadworthy than they were worth. But the Silver Shadow, when they went to this crazy Citroen hydraulic system, made it really complex, and we're not going to get into all the system, but it's got mechanically driven pumps. They run off the camshaft, and they build up pretty high pressure in accumulators. The accumulators store the pressure. The working pressure is normally 1800 to 2200 psi. It has a linkage system to the brake pedal. Remember how the Silver Cloud had that mechanical linkage that didn't do anything with the hydraulics until the mechanical linkage engaged it? This is almost the same thing. But the nice thing about this is you don't have to be moving. As soon as the car starts, it's building pressure, and it's supposed to build pressure and hold it in reserve until you need the brakes. So the nice thing about these is bleeding them. So there's no pumping. I don't have to do any of that manual pumping. I don't have to worry about fluid sucking back in on the hose. Once the car's running and the brakes are applied, it just keeps pumping until it runs out of fluid. It'll just keep pumping. And that can be scary when you blow a hose and you hit the brakes a few times, and then this car has a low fluid warning light. They didn't, like that 74 doesn't have a low fluid light, so you don't know if you're running out of fluid, but when you run out of fluid, you have absolutely no brakes. It has a parking brake, and it's a parking brake, or they called it a hand brake on the early cars, that has these tiny little brake pads. They're probably that big on each side, and they're meant to hold a car from rolling when it's parked. It's a parking brake. It's not an emergency brake. A lot of people think they're the same thing, and they are not. So anyways, to bleed the brakes on this, you have to have the car running. It has this big reservoir over here. It's a split system also. It's got this giant reservoir. This holds close to a gallon. It's usually about a gallon and a half, I would guess, but for the whole system when it's full. It has these sight glasses. This tells you the levels here, and you can see they're kind of dirty. So like this back one, you can see it's all brown and goobery looking up there. That is part of that black stuff is not necessarily water getting into the system, it's rubber breaking down. And this is unlike the other car where somebody asked about, can't you just change the fluid in the reservoir and it'll flush the system? This is constantly running. So when you apply the brakes, it sends high pressure out to the wheels. When you let go of the brakes, it recircles it. The calipers will retract, so you're still going to have that fluid out there. But the system is always running. It's either building pressure or just bypassing and just sending it back up to the reservoir. But it's always running. As long as the engine is running, it is moving brake fluid. One important thing for tow truck drivers, if you have one of these cars towed, is you make sure that the driver understands the car will not have brakes unless it's running. Now, a perfect system that has been run recently will have brakes if it's not running, but it's better to err on the safe side, because a car with a marginal system that hasn't run in a long time will not have any brakes. So you can push that brake pedal and it's not going to stop, and they will roll off those tow trucks. With the Silver Cloud, usually it's good to start at the back of the system. This is a 76, so it has two high pressure systems in the back. The lower one is the number 2, the upper one is the number 1. 74 and older Shadows, the lower one is a master cylinder, which is a low pressure pumping style bleeding. So I always start with the top bleeder on this, the number 1 system. This one tends to get more air in it than any other part of the system, and you do the same kind of, you put your hose on, and you crack this bleeder. Now you got to be careful. First of all, it's 2200 psi there. It's not going to gravity feed. It's going to come out in a hurry. So if you open it up real wide, it's going to blow your hose off. You're going to get it in your face. It's very dangerous. So I usually just crack it a little bit, and you can see fluid there. See how it just all of a sudden a bunch of junk came through? This foamy look is very common on this high pressure system. And what it is, in my opinion, is when you crack that bleeder, it's sucking air around those threads. It's coming out. So I wouldn't get, you want to get the big bubbles out. And you can feel them, you can see it on this hose usually. Okay, there it is. There we go. You can feel it, it's like a crackling sound when the big bubbles are coming out. There's not much air in this system, that's good. Now we'll go to the number 2. And I usually open it and close it a couple of times so that any air, the thing with the high pressure system is when you open it up, that's pushing fluid so fast that it's swirling in there. So I shut the bleeder real quick after I get some bubbles so that the air will go to the top, because the bubbles always go to the top or whatever. And then I keep doing it until I no longer feel the big bubbles coming through. Okay, so one thing you got to remember is on the number 1 system, the top bleeder. If you open it up and a big chute comes out, a whole bunch comes out, and then it just stops and you'll hear a clunk. It's a definite clunk. You hear it and it's under the body is where it's at. It's in the rat trap up in here. That is called a G valve. It's designed so that in a panic stop, it disables half of the rear brakes so you don't lose traction and go into a spin. But the problem is if it stays in that situation where it's locked up and you let the car go down the road without fixing it, then the rear wheels will start smoking because the brakes are holding on. Even though it's not much pressure, it's still holding on. So you have to address that. If you get that situation where you get a bunch of fluid come out and then just pop, you hear this pop, then what you have to do is turn the car off, depressurize the system completely. And you do that by just turning the ignition on so the warning lights work, but not starting it, and just pumping the brakes. So both lights come on, and you'll if you listen closely, you hear a little thud. And what it is it's a big ball bearing in a housing. So when you hit that panic stop, the ball bearing goes up and it goes up against a rubber seal, and that's that thump when it locks up. And when you depressurize it, it relieves all the pressure on it, so then it just rolls back down, and it's a real light, almost like a dink noise. You can hear it. So it didn't happen on this car. I didn't want to do it because it annoys me. But it's very important that you address it. Don't just leave it, because you're going to smoke your brakes. There we go, number 1 system. And if you open the bleeder and you don't get any fluid out, then you need to address that. That usually means either you've got a plugged line, steel line, or you have some flex hoses that are plugged up. What happens to the flex hoses, the rubber hoses, is they look great on the outside, usually. But sometimes they'll get aneurysms, you'll see that. On some and they'll be kind of damp, and they'll get like an actual bubble on the outside skin, and that's where fluid is kind of passing through and taking that outer rubber layer and making it into like a blister. But what happens on the ones that look fine is the inside is just like our arteries. Over time, with buildup, they shrink and shrink and shrink, and they'll shrink to the point to where you can get some fluid, but it doesn't release the brakes when you take off the pressure. So it acts like a check valve. So you always, if you have problems bleeding, you always want to replace your hoses. See, we've got a bunch of air there. You saw that, right? And you see that stuff just comes out in a hurry. All right. Yes.
I've heard inside of the right hose, an old hose will also swell up.
Right, they'll turn into a check valve, essentially. So you'll apply the brakes and then they won't release. So you can always get it off a fast idle. Like this is the throttle linkage here. So now what we're going to do is going to let the car back down. I use some fluid. I want to check the reservoirs. We'll do the front brake. You always want to run it a couple minutes before you check the fluid before bleeding, because the levels will go down. You can see, I can barely see that this level's down to the top up level there. Okay, and this one is just under. So I'm going to add some fluid, because when you bleed these brakes, you get a lot more fluid. A lot more fluid. You can see that fluid moving down there, just the right angle. I don't use anything else. Okay, now we're going to raise the car.